Back when railroads were one of the main forms of transportation, Southern Ohio was crisscrossed with many railroad lines, which required tunnels to get through the numerous mountains and hills in Appalachia. Deep in the woods of Southern Ohio is a very famous tunnel known as the Moonville Tunnel. The tunnel was named after a small mining town called Moonville in Brown Township, which was founded in 1856 when the Marietta and Cincinnati railroads ran through these woods. At its peak, this town had about 100 residents, including local miners and their families. The tunnel was an easy way to get to Moonville, and there are many stories surrounding this legendary passageway. I've always heard about this place and wanted to make the journey, and finally, one day I was able to get to the tunnel. It was a decent-sized trip, but I was able to find the parking lot near the tunnel and park my car. I looked up, and many hundreds of feet away, I could see the tunnel nestled in the side of a hill. The railroad tracks had been removed many decades before, and now there was a gravel path that led directly to the tunnel. The tunnel is now part of a trail that leads through the hills of Southern Ohio. I made the trek across the bridge, which took me over the Raccoon Creek, and I took in the engineering that had taken place to build this tunnel. It is amazing what mankind can do as part of the transport for industry. I entered the tunnel and I felt the air go cold and damp. My footsteps echoed off the walls of the brick tunnel. I could still see the other end quite clearly as I made my way down the passageway. As I moved along, I thought I could hear a strange sound. It was the faint sound of a train whistle, which steadily grew louder. This was really off-putting, and it sent a spike of fear through my body because I couldn't see any train, and there were no tracks for it to travel on. But nonetheless, I started to feel the rumble in the ground of a train, and then the blasting of its horn. I instinctively moved to the side of the tunnel to get out of the way of whatever this phantom train was. The ground trembled under my feet, and I felt a blast of air that would have come from a giant moving train, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding at about a mile a minute, and eventually all the sounds faded away, leaving me in the tunnel trying to catch my breath. It took me a few minutes to recover, and I debated on whether just to turn around and leave or keep going to the end of the tunnel. I'd come this far, so I wasn't going to let this strange vision stop me. I looked further down the tunnel, and then I saw a light sparkling in the distance. It seemed to be floating above the ground and was slowly heading my way. Eventually, I could see there was a dark shape attached to this light. It looked like a lantern or something. It continued my way, and I began to back up a little bit because I didn't understand what I was seeing. And then, for the second time, I heard the sound of the train horn and felt the vibration of the earth under my feet. The whole tunnel was quaking from the approach of the phantom train. I saw the figure with the light turn to react, and then for a millisecond, I saw the train appear out of thin air. And for the second time, I heard the sound of the train horn and felt the vibration of the earth underneath my feet. The whole tunnel was quaking from the approach of this phantom train. I saw the figure with the lantern react, and then for a millisecond, I saw the train appear out of midair, and it plowed right into the figure with the lantern. I heard a scream, and then as quickly as everything appeared, it disappeared in an instant, and I was left gasping for air. This time, I decided I didn't need to see the end of the tunnel. I quickly made my way back out into daylight and out of the cold, damp tunnel. I would later read up on the tunnel, and there was a story about a plague that had gone through the Moonville community. A person had gone to try to stop the train to get medical aid, but the foreman of the train was instructed not to stop for fear of spreading any contagion. The poor man was struck and killed instantly by the train. This was a truly tragic tale, and as I drove away, I said a little prayer for the man who failed in his quest to help the small town of Moonville. Athens is located in southeastern Ohio. It is a quintessential college town, but on the hills above the campus sits a place that is known as the Ridges, but many years ago it was called the Athens Lunatic Asylum. The asylum was opened in January of 1874 to house Civil War veterans, the elderly, orphan children, violent criminals, and people suffering from various medical maladies including tuberculosis or mental illnesses. Back in those days, the treatment used would be considered barbaric by today's standards. They included electroshock therapy, lobotomies, hydrotherapy, and other cruel methods. At its peak, this asylum would house over 2,000 patients, which was well over its capacity. I had heard many stories about this place. It was a legend in the area, so I knew I had to visit it. As I drove up the hill, I saw that there was a graveyard with over 2,000 stones, the last of which was installed in 1972. As I looked, I could swear I saw a shape hovering among the tombstones, but as quickly as it appeared, it faded away. This sent a chill through me, but I just shook it off and continued to drive. The asylum is an impressive building spread over many acres of land. I have to admit, it fit the classic haunted building mold to a T, and it loomed over the city of Athens. The asylum was closed in the late 1970s, and the building was locked off from the public. But several years ago, they put an art museum on the first floor, so I decided that would be a good place to start to check out the building. Once inside, I could see some of the restored architecture, which was amazing to take in. I toured the art installations in the museum, but on my way out, I swear I could hear whispering coming from one of the side hallways. It seemed to bore directly into my head and gave me an uneasy feeling. I was able to walk away, and I asked the attendant at the front desk about the building being haunted, and they just kind of smiled and said, "That's what some people say, but, that's up to them. I've never seen anything here." After I left the museum, I made my way around the building, and I knew there were some secret ways to get into the closed-off parts. So I worked my way along the periphery of the structure, eventually finding a loose board, which allowed me to get inside. The place smelled of must and mold, and it was cold and dank. The paint peeled off the walls, and overall the place had an ominous, creepy feeling. Out of the air, I heard that whispering again. But this time, it felt like many voices jumbled together, and they surrounded me. Occasionally, I would hear a yelp of pain or fear. Eventually, these sounds came to be too much for me. I looked at one of the hallways, and I saw a dark form shambling my way, and this caused a cold sweat to break out on my body. I began to backtrack my way to where I got in, and I looked back, and I saw the shape was getting closer. It seemed like an oppressive feeling in the building was coming directly down on me. I got to the board that I pried out of the way and I pushed against it, trying to get outside. I could hear footsteps closing in on me. Finally, I was able to push the board out of the way and get outside. I ran several feet away from the building, trying to catch my breath and slow my heart down. I looked back and I saw the shape looming in one of the windows, and then it just disappeared. I decided I didn't need to see any more of that building, and I went back into Athens, to the land of living people, carefree college students, and a lot less ghost. Hocking Hills are located in southeastern Ohio, and they are the home to Old Man's Cave, which are numerous natural formations that are great for hiking and exploration. I found myself down there in the late fall when it was a bit cold and dreary, but there were a lot less people adventuring on the many trails. It was a good day for hiking, and I made my way on the trails and passed an occasional hiker and sharing a few pleasantries with them. The place was a natural wonder where the water had cut through the limestone, creating natural stone ravines that wound deep into the hills of southern Ohio. There was a stream running through the middle of Old Man's Cave, and various bridges allowed me to cross over that stream. The hiking trails were built by the WPA back in the 1930s and were very convenient. Eventually I got off onto one of the side trails and was moving along at a good pace when I heard some yelling. It sounded like a man who was screaming at somebody, and occasionally I would hear a woman yelling out in distress. The sounds echoed off the sides of the stone walls, and I was partially disoriented about the direction of which they were coming. What I was hearing was very disturbing because the woman sounded like she was in total fear. Eventually I was able to nail down a direction of where the sound was coming from, and I started to make my way toward the sounds to see if I could help this poor woman. The man's yelling grew more violent, and then suddenly I heard a terrifying scream echo through the woods and down the ravines. This, quite frankly, terrified me. Then I heard a chopping sound, and the woman's scream was cut short. This sent a strong feeling of despair through my whole psyche, because I knew I was too late to help this woman. I held my ground, trying to figure out what to do, and I looked down the trail, and I saw a shape coming toward me, and it had something in its hand. After a moment, I knew I didn't want to know what was in that person's hands. The shape kept coming, and it bellowed at me in a rage, and for a moment I was frozen in fear. Somehow I was able to break out of my trance, and I ran blindly down one of the paths. I glanced back, and I could see the dark shape still coming my way. And then I went into a full run. My lungs were bursting, but eventually I was able to get out of that ravine and into a parking lot where I saw a few people getting ready for their own hikes. And I felt a great sense of relief being back in normality. Later, I would talk to one of the park rangers about the lore of this area, and he told me about a man who had discovered his wife had been cheating, and then he had lopped off the head of her lover and eventually her head, which he carried through the caves of Hocking Hills. The park ranger kind of laughed, and I shook my head silently. He didn't seem to believe this story, but from what I had experienced, I think that angry man still lurks in the woods near Old Man's Cave.